My name is Howie, and it's a pleasure for me to introduce today's Hangout session. Today we are so lucky to have Dr. Sarah Howie from South Africa, and she will talk about simple investments in South Africa. During her presentation, you are welcome to raise questions or post comments in the chat section of the Hangout. And Sarah Howie will have some about half an hour afterwards to answer any of her questions. So please, Sarah, we look forward to hearing your presentation.
Thank you very much, Anna Berit, and also thank you very much to the IEEP for the honor of being able to share our experiences and findings from South Africa. I also want to congratulate you on this wonderful initiative that allows us to share knowledge and experiences from the field. So as I am currently in the field with the major PIRLS 2016, this seems to be a very good time to talk about our experiences of the IEA large-scale assessments in South Africa. What I would like to share with this group, and welcome to all the participants around the world, is basically I want to give you an overview after some introductory remarks about the rationale and processes for South Africa's participation in the IEA studies. And I want to focus on sharing some of our key findings for South Africa in two main studies that we've participated in. One being the TIMSS study, the Trends in Mathematics and Science study, the other being Progress in International Reading Literacy Studies. And then I want to conclude discussing somewhat the impact and meaning of these IEA studies for South Africa from our perspective. So just some introductory remarks, perhaps, that might be set the scene for our discussion. The purposes of international comparative studies vary quite considerably, and there are a number of different purposes that have been identified. But I want to focus on two of those, whilst there are many, which are very important and which give us the rationale for South Africa's participation in the international comparative studies. I think it's peculiar perhaps to the late 1980s and the early 1990s that the international comparative studies served a very important purpose, and that was the integration of excluded and isolated education systems into global discussions on education and human development. These would have included countries in the former Soviet bloc together with South Africa, who were isolated in that time because of the political policies. And so what the international studies did during that time was allow South Africa to, in particular, break away from its rather previously isolated position to join the international debates through projects such as the Third International Mathematics and Science Study, as it was known in 1995. And this was primarily due to the financial sponsorship of the World Bank and the training that had been administered by the IEA. The second purpose, which I think is irrelevant to this talk, is also the development of research capacity, which I think personally has been one of the IEA's most significant contributions. My personal observations during the 1990s was how much the IEA contributed to building the capacity in this broader assessment field. And for instance, people like the national research coordinators in these studies and the staff of national centers benefited tremendously. These two aspects in particular made it possible for countries like South Africa to participate. But we should also consider, for instance, the other important international initiatives in education policy that were occurring from the 1990s, because I think this also very much informs South Africa's participation in the IEA studies. And from the Education for All initiative from the Jean Tim conference, there were three tenets that were particularly important that emerged: access, equity, and quality, all of which were particularly meaningful for South Africa, where it was in its new democracy in 1994. And of course, coupled with the Dakar framework, where the 164 governments present adopted the framework for action, this meant that 6 goals ultimately were agreed upon, of which one touches very directly on the IEA studies and the reasons why South Africa participated. These improvements in education quality, number 6, that was identified as a key goal from this conference, was a key driver, I think, for the developing countries' participation, including South Africa. And in fact, this goal number 6, which at that point was really fed by debates in the past 10 years, shifting from how many children are going to school, the access question, to governments increasingly confronted with the question of how much are children learning, which is not to say that the depth and quality of learning were not being considered at that time. But this was important in terms of developing countries' challenges, which included at that stage not having measurable learning outcomes that were easily available. Now, if we take, for instance, more interesting and important context, the context is a very key for countries such as South Africa, but all countries really when it comes to the studies. And in the developing countries such as South Africa, we have a variety of education provisioning. It may be found from very poor schools where the infrastructure is fragile, underdeveloped, and even dangerous, not to mention very cold in winter, very hot in summer, generally undesirable conditions for learning, to the next category of poorly resourced schools comprising perhaps better accommodation in terms of buildings, but not adequately maintained and still not good conditions for learning, with classrooms being under-resourced, overcrowded, and sometimes as many as 200 children found in a classroom. But in developing environment, you may find very well resourced schools, which are in fact world-class, comprising excellent infrastructure and resources. In our developing world, these are often privatized, but you also find very good public schools where resources are available. And why do I put forward these issues around context? Well, for international studies in particular to explain achievement, there are a number of key questions that keep arising in terms of how do we find ways of measuring across a variety of contexts, varying from conditions within a country like South Africa. And if we look at these key questions, we struggle therefore with issues of cross-national validity, which may range from high to medium to low, depending on issues that are being measured in terms of the cross-national case down to the national case, which lead us to questions such as how do we deal with diversity when we come to the measuring of these issues? And I think these are the kinds of questions that arose when we entered South Africa entered the IEA studies. We came in with very little experience in 1995, and therefore when we started with the growth of different studies right across Africa, most countries started from a very low base in terms of the capacity to undertake these studies. And you can just see from the growth of IEA studies just in Africa alone, pre-1990s to post-1990s, how other countries have also taken up the notion of how we're going to measure not only learning outcomes, but also contextual variation. So important to give you perhaps the international audience some idea about what education in South Africa comprises before I go immediately into the IEA studies. And you'll see that we have about 12 million students across 26,000 schools. We generally spend a lot of our budget on education. Our net enrollment at primary level is almost universally achieved. But the substantial challenge for the system is to provide the basic level of school infrastructure, which means that at this stage only 77% of the schools have very basic facilities and meet the basic safety norms, which you could say are not ideal for the conditions of education. So bearing this in mind and bearing the variation, South Africa went into the IEA studies in the 1990s, participating in primarily 3 studies: the Trends in Mathematics and Science study, the Second Information Technology and Education study, and the Progress in Reading Literacy study. And whilst they were at quite separate parts of times over the last 20 years, there was a rationale at the time for each one as we participated. And I will only focus today on the TIMSS and PIRLS studies, mainly because I was the NRC for both, and I also contributed as NRC to the sites, which gives me a wide experience to talk across and reflect upon the experience of these 3 different studies. Starting with the TIMSS study, which was really the IEA study that got us started. After years of political, social, economic isolation, there was really an absence of national data in South Africa when the democracy took hold in 1994 and when TIMSS was actually initiated. And in 1990, TIMSS 95 was really regarded as a baseline study, providing us with very important comparative education data after years and decades of isolation. And it was seen as a potential longitudinal study for us with important trend data. Of the last 6 TIMSS studies, South Africa has actually participated 5 times. Initially, South Africa focused on grade 8 in 1995 and also participated at the grade 12 level. In 2011, a decision was made to shift the data collection to grade 9. I'll talk a little bit later about that. And you'll see in 2015, we're participating both at the grade 4 and the grade 9 level. If we have a look closely at what has happened, and I'm just going to take mathematics achievement to start with, the patterns for science are quite similar. But if we look at what happened between 1995 and 2011, with regard to South Africa's performance, we will see on this left-hand side graph that South Africa's student scores were very low, indeed from the very first study in 1995. But this was also repeated in 1999 and 2003. They performed more than 200 points lower on that 1,000-point scale than countries such as Australia, England, Singapore, and USA, and more than 100 points below middle-income countries such as Chile, Malaysia, and Tunisia. And because of this low performance, South Africa decided that obviously the test was proving to be very difficult for our grade 8 students, and it switched for the 2011 study to test students at the grade 9 level. The performance levels, however, remained low, and be seen now on this second graph on the right-hand side. There's a significant gap still in education terms, with South African grade 9 learners being 3 to 4 years behind grade 8 learners from Australia, England, and USA, and as many as 6 years behind Singapore's grade 8 learners, in terms of, if we calculate 40 points representing an education year as is typically taken. These results provide or present a huge challenge to South African policymakers and practitioners, and have done since the very first study in 1995. Having a closer look at the differences in performance, looking at what was called then the international marker levels, now referred to more as benchmarks. But in those days, in the 1995 study, I think the shock was that there's so very few students who are performing at what was the top level then, the top 10% of the learners, and even fewer participating, in fact, the top 50% compared to countries like England and Singapore, where in Singapore, for instance, you would have had 80% reaching the top 50%, compared to a small proportion, less than 10% in South Africa. And the pattern was very similar in science. And I think this was what came as the great surprise to South African policymakers. If we look at the comparisons between 1999 and 2003, by comparing the grade 8 student mathematics performance in 1999 with the grade 8 as it was then, 2003, we saw that the students, 1999, 86% of them, as represented by the red bar here, did not manage to attain the international benchmarks as they were represented. This grew to 90% in 2003, and it was at this point that South Africa decided to withdraw from the 2007 TIMSS study after they realized these very low results. One can't help contrasting it with a top performer, where 99% of the participants in both 1999 and 2003 actually attained the international benchmarks. This is a tremendous contrast, and I think highlighted the problem. Science, by the way, was very similar to that. And then it was in 2011, 8 years later, where it was very important to monitor these benchmarks in particular to see how South Africa re-emerged. What was significant, I think, was that in contrast to Botswana and Honduras, there was a very tiny percentage of students, tiny, but it was there, of students who actually met the highest benchmark. And this was a little sign of hope. However, a major concern was this large group of 76% who did not reach any of the international benchmarks, which was similar to the experience of Honduras. Botswana didn't seem to have quite as many that fell into this category. I suppose this was really the bad news element. And some of the explanations that were given at the time, which is now nearly 4 years ago, were that the students tested in maths and science appeared to have a very low self-concept in mathematics and science. The parents were less involved than parents in other countries. The teachers' expectations, these are maths and science teachers, were on the low side. There were very large class sizes. There were relatively young and inexperienced teachers that were filling these roles. And the mathematics and science teachers were not confident in what they were teaching. This certainly was also the case from 1995 and 1999. So consistently, there has been a profile of teachers revealing their lack of confidence, and apparently the results are correlating with those feelings of low self-confidence. Moving to the other study that we participated in, the other achievement study, PIRLS in South Africa. This study came directly or followed on directly from the TIMSS study. And this was really because of the research, the secondary analysis that had been undertaken on the TIMSS 99 study, which showed that I observed the most significant predictor explaining 27% of the variance in the test score. This is the mathematics achievement. And this had been explained by the English language proficiency, which had was measured as a separate English test, which is an interesting example of national options that can be included, by the way, into these international studies. And it was included in a national option in 1999. This particular study provided us with empirical evidence of a problem for which up until then there'd been a lot of anecdotal evidence. And in the 1999 study, we managed to get a national sample and actually reveal the extent of what we perceived at that point to be the language problem. This really got me thinking that if the grade 8 learners were struggling with their language proficiency because they were tested in English for these TIMSS tests, these were evidenced by the low scores on the English test, and it could have had a negative impact on their learning right across the curriculum. So once the Center for Evaluation and Assessment at the University of Pretoria was established, one of the first projects I wanted to initiate was actually the PIRLS study, which is a reading comprehension study targeting the 4th grade in most countries. And I wanted to see whether this would allow us to get some insight into what was happening at the primary school level where the language proficiency would have been established. PIRLS itself internationally has been measuring reading comprehension since 2001, and South Africa participated or has participated since 2006. It's not been an easy process because in South Africa there is quite a complex language policy that allows learners to learn in their home language from grade 1 to 3. But from grade 4 onwards, all children will learn in either Afrikaans or English, with the implication, therefore, that 80% of the learners will learn in a second, third, or foreign language. So PIRLS tests the language that the children will have been learning in from grade 1 to grade 3. At grade 4, this could either be the language of learning and teaching or the home language. But as you can imagine, it has serious implications for the research design in PIRLS. And in 2006, we tested, therefore, in 11 languages at grade 4 and grade 5. This was also done in 2011. And again, in 2016, we are currently in the field testing in 11 languages again at grade 4 and 3 languages at grade 5. If we look at what happened in 2006, a quick overview of the findings in 2006, then what we see is it was the first time, in fact, that South Africa had participated in a study where 11 languages, all 11 languages had been tested using an international comparative study. By the way, I think it's the first time that an international study had tested so many languages in any country, in any single country. Most of the children in South Africa wrote in a home language. Initially, I had some concerns about the level of the test being too difficult for our grade 4 students, so therefore we decided to include grade 5 as well. So we had 2 samples participating in 11 languages. The results showed my concerns had been valid to the extent that the International Study Centre actually removed the grade 4 students from this table and included at the bottom only the South African grade 5 students who achieved 302 points, as you can see from this table, which is more than 250 points below the Russian Federation and 6 years in education terms behind the Russian grade 4 students. So that was quite disturbing, which led to the media response being quite intense. And this is just one example of some of the kinds of reaction that we had at that study, and I'll come back to that a little bit later. But what it revealed was a so-called reading crisis in terms of, and led to a significant redesign for our PIRLS 2011 study in South Africa. Only 2 of the 11 languages fell within 100 points. These 2 languages here fell within 100 points of the international average. And it just revealed very clearly that the international assessment was far too difficult for our grade 5 children in most of the languages that we tested in. And clearly there was a need for an easier assessment for the South African grade 4s. So the solution to that was to join the prePIRLS for the 2011 study. Looking a little bit more closely at what was considered a crisis at the time was in this graph, again, the South African children, the grade 5 level, the percentage of children who did not reach the PIRLS international benchmarks is represented in red, that is 78%. The 22% did achieve the international benchmarks from low to advanced. And as you can see, almost 8 out of 10 children at grade 5 level and almost 9 out of 10 children at grade 4 level couldn't reach any of the international benchmarks, which contrasted to the international average of 6%, where 94% of children internationally could reach these benchmarks. Then the 2011 study followed from the 2006 study. And what we saw quite quickly was in 2011, the general observation was that there were fewer developing countries participating in PIRLS to TIMSS. I think there was a general push from policymakers that mathematics and science is so crucial. And I'm not sure that all have realized or appreciated the link between language proficiency and other subjects, for instance. However, in this table graph, you will see on the left, you'll see the highest mean scores in PIRLS 2011 were all high-income countries, with Hungary being the only developing economy amongst the top 20 countries. South Africa, which was only a benchmark participant because of the limited participation, they only participated in English and in Afrikaans, and so therefore were only considered a benchmark participant. If you have a look at how the African countries participated, Botswana, South Africa, Morocco at both grade 4 and grade 6, and in fact Morocco was the only country that tested in PIRLS proper at grade 4 level. You'll see that South African grade 5 children actually compared favorably with their grade 6 counterparts from Botswana and from Morocco. However, as I say, it's not a nationally representative sample. When we looked at the easier pre-PIRLS test that had been then administered in 2011, it was introduced after the International Study Centre, and the IEA quite wisely saw that the PIRLS test was simply too difficult for actually quite a few countries in the 2006 sample, the participants. They decided to introduce the pre-PIRLS study. And unfortunately, only 3 countries ended up participating due to the events that were happening in 2011. Nonetheless, it was a very interesting exercise. South Africa, with testing in all 11 languages at the grade 4 level, performed similarly to Botswana, but both performed significantly below Colombia, which was also, I think, far greater than anybody had anticipated, this gap between those countries. If you have a closer look at the South African grade 4 learners' performance, and this arose another issue. Across many developing environments, children attend school often in a language which is not their home language. And so we wanted to see the patterns that were emerging. And in fact, some interesting patterns did emerge as test language and home language seemed to differ. And this seemed to increase in 2011, where 70% of the children, for instance, who wrote in English, these two groups, in fact, were doing so not in their home language. What this graph represents, the light blue graph, represents the children who were tested in their home language, and these children, in fact, were tested, tested in a language that was different to their home language. So overall, what came out of the study was that children writing in their home language performed better, perhaps not such a surprise. The largest difference in scores was found amongst the children who were actually tested in English, of which 70% wrote in a second or third language. But these second language English learners still achieved at least 50 points above their peers, for instance, in the highest other African language that had been tested. So there were quite some debates that arose as a result of these results. If we have a look, for instance, on how the languages varied, and these are the 11 languages tested at grade 4, what was a concern at the time of the release of the results is that we still had almost a third of the children who did not reach any of the international benchmarks. What is perhaps more of a concern is the variation that you find across the languages. From one language, Chivenda, where 53% of the children did not achieve the benchmarks, 57% in the Sepedi language, compared to, say, let's say 10% in English. And this variation was something that was very important, we felt, to monitor also going forward, but produced grave concerns. So having participated in 2006 and then again in 2011, there was a small group that we could do some comparison over time, and that was the group that wrote in Afrikaans and wrote in English. And between these two groups, we could see no significant difference after 5 years overall and also across these two groups. And these were particular points of concern that were raised: the lack of growth. But in addition to that, there was a concern that at the grade 5 level, we had observed that 43% of the children had not yet developed the basic reading skills required for reading at a grade 4 level internationally. We also observed that rural and township children were about 2 to 2.5 years behind their urban counterparts in reading. More than half of the South African schools had no libraries whatsoever, which was the second highest percentage internationally after Morocco. And more than half of the grade 4 children reported the highest levels of bullying seen internationally at primary school level. And these results really highlight some of the important data that comes from studies like the IEA, a variety of data. So if we take a step back and say, having taken part in IEA studies for 20 years, what can we say in terms of their impact and meaning for South Africa? Well, for me, to be honest, the PIRLS results released in 2012, as those in 2007, had a feeling of déjà vu back to TIMSS 1995. The 2011 front pages of the newspaper resembled those headlines, but then the media does like a bad news story. But there was tremendous disappointment in the achievement results being so low, and there was real anger amongst language practitioners and academics that this was actually the case. I think what was different, though, in 2012 compared to earlier studies was the level of denial by the government. In the early days, 1995 through to 1999, there were real attempts to deny or discredit the IEA studies. But since 2000, there's been a shift. And so the very poor results of 2006 were lower. They could have been better. They really did result in a national outcry, which put pressure on the National Department of Education and even led to questions being raised in the Parliament about the low performance and also demanding what initiatives were going to be put in place. What we've seen then is a different approach being adopted by the policymakers, and let's say a larger scale implementation of assessments being implemented since 2000, to the extent now that a national assessment system has been implemented. And of course, as all these systems have teething problems in the beginning, it isn't without its problems, but nonetheless, there is a plan that is unfolding in terms of these assessments. What we're seeing increasingly is in the national policy-making reports and in policy papers serving in Treasury, there's more and more about how we're learning from PIRLS and TIMSS, as illustrated in this one report I put in front. So finally, turning to reflections on these studies in South Africa. TIMSS, certainly, it was highly controversial when it was introduced 20 years ago, and I think there still is some controversy around the study. The results really surprised and shocked and produced outrage about the low performance and started queries about the context and conditions of schooling. Business community, I think, hadn't been aware at that point of what was actually happening within schooling. I think the subsequent studies, TIMSS 95 right through to 2011, have revealed the damage of past political policies and difficulties of implementing effective change in teaching and learning. And in what we're seeing is wide usage of the data and the results from TIMSS being used in policy documents and funding motivations, for instance. PIRLS was a little different in that it was hit by more political imperatives to test in all 11 languages, which was very difficult for both the IEA and the National Study Centre to try and handle just the logistics. It results in having more than 200 versions of instruments, which are very difficult to actually manage and control. The very poor results when the 2006 study, I think also like the 1995 TIMSS results, produced quite a lot of shock and surprise in terms of being as low relatively to other countries as they had been. And again, raised in Parliament, and this was incidented about Parliament discussing reading, which was actually quite refreshing. But it really did put pressure on the government to react. The 2011, the easier test prePIRLS, which is now PIRLS literacy in 2016, we think it serves as a very important baseline for grade 4 for the PIRLS 2016 study. And as I said, the PIRLS 26 study has gone, 16 study is now currently in the field in all 11 languages, once again at the grade 4 level. And at grade 5 level, we've added isiZulu in an attempt to see whether or not 10 years after the 2006 study, there is any shifting amongst the African languages performance. And so isiZulu is underway at the moment. There's a considerable amount of secondary analysis that's been undertaken from our centre, but other centres and policymakers around the country currently, which means that these studies have been highly relevant for the South African education context, and also in terms of other initiatives, education initiatives around the country. So coming to a close in terms of my formal part of my presentation, I want to say that in the words, I would say that the significance of the findings, from these studies are that despite almost universal access, we have evidence of systemic failure in education. Currently, the non-achievement of benchmarks also reveals that learners are about 2 to 4 years behind where they could be expected to when we look at the international performance. The classroom conditions overall, whilst they're slow to improve, the IEA data is showing improvement. For instance, the reduction in class sizes is evident. That the impact of the curriculum revision, which has been extensive over the past 20 years, is quite difficult to measure at this stage. The IEA studies have also led to a broader enlightenment of broader interest groups outside of just the narrow education circles as well. Business and industry has become far more involved in education. And the research has been showing, for instance, key predictors of achievement. For instance, we are starting to understand the effect of language and also of poverty on the social and education conditions currently. It's really revealed the reading problem in African languages, which is also at the moment exacerbated by the fact that we have few teachers graduating with African home language. And there are many examples, in fact, and there are a couple that I've listed here where the IEA studies have had a direct effect. So one of the most significant was the extension, for instance, of the instructional year to 200 days, which was based on the analysis of the TIMSS data in the 1990s, but there are several others. So in the words of our late statesman and President Nelson Mandela, education is the most powerful weapon which you can use to change the world. I think as an education research community in South Africa, we've got a significant amount of work to do to address our fractured past and to try to create the very best conditions we can for educating our children. We think that the IEA studies are providing us with data to learn lessons from countries around us, neighbors, trading partners, cultural partners, as well as competitors. And we think that we have to succeed in providing opportunities in education for our young people. Because if we fail to provide relevant and effective education to our poorest and youngest citizens of our country, we are dooming them to an almost unbreakable cycle of poverty, where only the brightest will escape. So collecting data on the relevance and effectiveness of our education system is key. What the studies do show generally is what is possible given certain conditions. And I think these are very important: conditions, policies, and practice. And we think there's no reason to believe why an average 10-year-old in South Africa cannot read as well as the average child in Korea, Finland, or New Zealand. But perhaps we should not be expecting less because the child lives in South Africa. So very important to us is how we actually use the IEA data. We need to use it well. We have to use it in an appropriate manner. We have to use it in a careful manner, considering all the sensitivities. And probably what I can say from the South African experience is we're still trying to learn how to do this better. And I think at this point, that's a good point to stop and invite questions. And thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Sarah. Very interesting presentation. I think you have addressed quite a lot of the concerns that participants in the eForum have had during this last discussion, especially about the relevance of international studies in the developing countries. We have a couple of questions from listeners. The first one relates to the grades that you test. The question: if students are performing poorly at grade 8, does it make sense to switch and test them at grade 9 instead? Or does the education need to improve before grade 8 so that they are better prepared on time? And also, they ask how many countries have done something like this, like testing at a later grade.
Okay, would you like me to address that directly, Anna-Berit? I think this is a very important question, and it's one that I wasn't privy to, the decision. In fact, I left the organization that is running TIMSS now was the organization I used to work for, the Human Sciences Research Council. And I was involved in the 95 and 99 study, and then in 2001 I moved to the university. I think at the time, the feeling was that grade 9 is a very important exit level for South African students. It's the end of compulsory education. And so the feeling was that whilst the grade 8 students were battling so much on the TIMSS tests, that the measurement of that was becoming difficult. They felt that TIMSS provided them with excellent opportunity to keep measuring the exit level of this compulsory schooling system at the grade 9 level. And I couldn't agree more by saying, yes, we have to intervene at the primary level, which is where my interest actually switched to when I moved over to PIRLS. But I think both are actually important to monitor over time. So I would support the notion of continuing to monitor at grade 9 simply because it's something we don't have any other, let's say, comparable measures in place to do nationally, not yet at the right level. But I am aware that this time round they have also started to monitor grade 4. And I think the TIMSS 2015 grade 4 results will be very, very important to deciding the way forward on how to intervene in the schooling system appropriately.
Thank you.
I don't know whether that... to answer the second part of the question, sorry, there were 3 countries that also tested at grade 9 level. In fact, Botswana and Honduras were the other 2 that also decided to do the same thing. I don't know if that was also a similar reason to the South Africans. I have no idea, to be quite honest, why they did that, other than the test was clearly too difficult as well.
Yeah, thank you, Sarah. Also, was there a consideration the relation to curriculum and whether the curriculum was better fit for the grade 9? Is that also something you considered?
The grade 9 curriculum, the grade 8 curriculum, in fact, was a good match, has always been a good match. So the curriculum, from the analysis that we did in 95 and 99, we saw high levels of curriculum match overlap. So I don't think it was really a curriculum issue per se. I think it's actually a teaching and learning issue that goes beyond the curriculum. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. There is also a related question to this on PIRLS and prePIRLS or PIRLS
Yeah.
literacy. So could you just explain a little bit why you decided to do the prePIRLS test and switch from PIRLS to prePIRLS? Did you actually do both?
Sorry, I didn't quite catch the question there, Anna-Berit.
The question reads, could you explain more about the rationale behind switching from PIRLS to prePIRLS?
Of course.
Yeah.
Okay. I think that one was quite straightforward, to be quite frank. The grade 4 in South Africa is the transition point of the majority of children switching from learning in a home language to learning in second language. So we were always going to be concerned about their language proficiency levels at that stage. It's a difficult year for our children across the grade 4 level. When they performed as poorly as they did in 2006, I think that validated the concern I had. And at that point, we decided, together with the International Study Center, that an easier test which would provide us with more information, better measurement, would be more appropriate for our grade 4 learners. And that was really the reason that at that point we decided, let's try and measure, get a better measure of what our children can actually do, because we're just getting information about what they can't do. And then we decided to go with the group of children who seemed to be managing, although not as well as we'd hoped, to continue with those two groups. And now we've added a third group. And the rationale for adding isiZulu, particularly that language group, is because it's our largest language group in the country, our largest African language group in particular, and because they also performed better in 2006 relative to the other language groups. So the combined rationale, if you like, for adding them to the other two languages for now, to see, it's almost experimental to see if there has been any change. Yeah.
Thank you. We also have a question from Morocco, and they are concerned about if South Africa did anything to try help education in other African countries. And you may also say something about what you think are the strong points in the South African education.
Well, I think South Africa has worked a lot in partnerships with other countries. What I can say is that on the teacher education side, I think South Africa has actually learned quite a lot from other African countries. So countries like Zimbabwe and Kenya, for instance, taught us quite a lot about teacher education in the early 90s. So I think that there are quite a number of projects looking at various partnerships supporting each other. With regard to the IEA studies, we might not have had as much connection as we should have had. Maybe we could be working more closely, and I would really welcome the opportunity to do that. I know that we've worked in partnership with different members of the Botswanan team, but that has been mainly because they've come down as students studying postgraduate programs with us here in South Africa. But we've got quite a number of postgraduates actually coming to learn about IEA studies and other large-scale assessment studies at the University of Pretoria, where we have the Center for Evaluation and Assessment. So at the moment, we probably have representatives from at least 10 African countries who've been coming on the different postgraduate programs, but not a separate project to look at various partnerships. Yeah.
Thank you.
We would be open to this and encourage it.
I also have a question myself. You mentioned very early in your presentation that capacity building was one of the main things about participating in the IA studies. Could you say a little bit more about that, and also what is required internally in countries in order to take part in international studies like this?
Yes, definitely. I think in 1995, the Human Sciences Research Council was always a major body in research, but it was basically it was a body that up until then had not done any large scale and certainly no international studies because of the isolation. So the capacity was limited to a number of measurement specialists who had not undertaken the kind of work that the IEA had been presenting in its studies. So what the kind of capacity development that I saw was survey methodology, sampling, certainly software development, use of software, statistical packages, understanding about data in general. I think the IEA has given most people who've participated a much greater, deeper understanding of the meaning of data and how to interpret data, and both the limitations and the benefits of the data. And there have been a number of fantastic initiatives around, for instance, the IRT, the utilization of it in these kinds of assessment studies. There have been basic training programs from things like scoring. You think that marking, we talk about marking in South Africa, but the kind of large-scale scoring that has been taught to us and different methodologies that have been implemented, all of these were very, very valuable in terms of South Africa's growth in large-scale assessment studies. So from junior to senior members, there's been tremendous opportunities, and that's what I think IEA has done remarkably well. It combines it and integrates it with its meetings. Then it held specialist training sessions in between for every phase of the project. And then over and above that, it offers these specialist workshops. And I think that's been a tremendous, tremendous success. And that's really what other organizations could really learn from the IEA in terms of how these are done and how effectively these are done.
I had one other question about the interaction between countries, and
Yes.
because the person who asked the question also wants to know about the strong features of the South African education system. Could you say something about where you think you really are strong in education?
Strong in education, of course. I pointed out, I think on TIMSS, the percentage of children reaching that advanced benchmark. And I think what we do have and what we would strive to build upon are these centers of excellence within the government schooling system, where you find very highly trained teachers with many years of experience who have been very involved in their own capacity development of other teachers. So what I have seen working very well has been the partnerships, for instance, between strong, well-resourced schools and schools with less resources, working together, building capacity in subjects like mathematics and science. I think that's worked very, very well. There have also been a number of very strong non-government organizations who've been making great contributions across the country and I think beyond, working on reading initiatives and providing resources to schools over and above what government is providing. So there are elements that are indeed still strong. I would like to see, of course, that they are expanded and escalated on a much greater level. But those would be the areas where I think we are doing, there's good signs, strong signs of hope. But they need to be more, of course, and that's what I would like to see myself. I also think there's some systems which are very promising. But, we just want more of them.
Thank I have asked a question for you. During the eForum, we have had a discussion about why we need international tests and also which competencies and skills are the most important to test internationally. I would like to hear your opinion and thought about this.
That's a nice, easy question, I see. I think coming from a system where 20 years ago we had no information, I think I can speak from that because I've seen the growth. And I think that perhaps what we need are a well-designed set of national tests which cover a greater variety of skills than we currently do now. We currently focus on language, usually home language, a first language level. We concentrate on mathematics and we concentrate on science. Where I truly think we are missing is the 21st century skills, more problem-solving skills in general, and I would like to see some reasoning and argumentative type of skills being introduced, which you typically find more in the humanities, education, and social sciences. I think this is a gap that we have at the moment. But for me, I would have less regular but better designed, better equipped tests that cover a greater variety of skills that I think children need beyond schooling, not only immediately within schooling.
Thank you very much, Sarah, and thank you for joining us today and giving this very good presentation, very interesting. So thank you so much. And also to viewers, I would like to encourage you to post further questions and comments also on the forum. So thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much. Appreciate that.